The needle slipped through the white cotton with a whisper so soft it barely disturbed the silence of the Donovan kitchen, and Nora Ramsey did not hear the footsteps stop in the doorway behind her. She did not hear Clement Donovan's breath catch. She did not see the way his hand, rough and calloused from 7 years of working the hardest stretch of land in Cochise County, Arizona, rose slowly to grip the doorframe as if he needed it to hold himself upright. She was simply sewing. Simply mending the torn collar of Eli's Sunday shirt, the one the boy had caught on a fence nail 3 weeks ago and never mentioned to his father, because he knew the weight his father already carried. She had found both shirts folded at the bottom of the laundry basket that morning, not placed there by anyone's request, not pointed out or explained, just quietly present the way so many urgent things in this household were quietly present, waiting for someone to notice, waiting for someone to care enough to act. Nora had noticed. She had cared. She had threaded her needle without a word to anyone, sat herself down at the kitchen table in the blue morning light while 8-year-old Eli and 6-year-old Thomas were still sleeping, and she had begun. Clement stood in that doorway, and he did not move for a long time. He had spent the last 4 months building walls around himself with the methodical precision of a man who believed he was protecting something. He had hired Nora Ramsey on because Mrs. Callahan at the general store had told him he was running those boys ragged, and they needed a woman's steady hand in the house. He had told himself it was a practical arrangement. He had told himself the papers he had signed with the agency in Tucson were no different from hiring a ranch hand. He had told himself he was not lonely. He had told himself the dark past that had taken his wife Clara 18 months ago in a fever that swept through the valley and left half the ranchers widowed. That dark past was a wall, not a wound, and walls were things you leaned against, not things that crumbled. But standing in the doorway watching Nora Ramsey mend his son's Sunday shirts without being told, without any expectation of recognition or reward, with nothing but quiet, steady purpose in every movement of her hands, Clement Donovan felt the wall shift. It terrified him. He stepped back into the shadows of the hallway before she could turn around, and he stood there for another full minute pressing the back of his head against the cool plaster wall, staring at the ceiling, breathing through the strange and forbidden ache that had opened in the center of his chest. He told himself it meant nothing. He was still telling himself that when he walked out to the barn and saddled his horse at 6 in the morning and rode the fence line for 3 hours in the cold October air, trying to outrun something he was beginning to suspect could not be outrun. This was the moment Nora Ramsey became a problem for Clement Donovan. This was the moment everything changed. But to understand why a man as guarded as Clement would let himself be undone by something as quiet as a woman mending shirts, you had to understand how he and Nora had arrived at that kitchen, and what both of them had already survived to get there. The year was 1883, and the territory of Arizona was not a forgiving place to be. Clement Donovan had come west from County Cork by way of Kansas City in 1869, following his older brother Patrick, who had died of a snake bite in New Mexico before Clement ever got there. He had arrived in Cochise County with $47, a mule named Abraham, and a stubbornness that the desert seemed to recognize and respect. He had filed his homestead claim on 320 acres of rough scrub land south of the town of Harlow's Creek, and he had spent 5 years breaking that land before it began to give anything back. He had met Clara Whitfield at a church social in 1874 when she was 22 and he was 28. Clara had been the schoolteacher's daughter, all honey-colored hair and practical intelligence, and she had not been impressed by Clement's Irish charm or his broad shoulders or the way other women watched him. She had been impressed by the fact that he listened when she spoke and did not talk over her. That had sealed it. They had married in the spring of 1875, and Clara had come to the ranch and made it a home with the same quiet competence she brought to everything. Eli had been born in 1875, Thomas in 1877. Life had been hard, but it had been good. Clement had added another 100 acres to his claim, built a proper house with real window glass and a front porch, and he had been genuinely happy in the uncomplicated way that a man is happy when he does not yet know what he stands to lose. Clara had died in the spring of 1882 during a fever outbreak that swept through the valley following a particularly wet winter. She had been 30 years old. She had died holding Clement's hand, and she had told him to take care of the boys, and she had not been afraid. It was Clement who had been afraid. It was Clement who had not let go of her hand for 2 hours after she was gone, sitting in the chair beside the bed while Eli and Thomas slept in the next room, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how a man was supposed to continue in the world when the thing that made the world comprehensible to him was no longer in it. He had continued, of course. He had continued because of Eli and Thomas, because the cattle needed feeding, because the mortgage on the additional acres needed paying, because continuing was what you did in 1882 Arizona if you intended to survive. But something in him had closed, quietly and completely, the way a door closes in a strong wind, and you do not hear the latch catch until later, when you try the handle and find it will not open. He had managed the house with grim efficiency for 18 months. He had fed the boys, clothed them, taken them to church on Sundays. He had hired day labor for the ranch and done the domestic tasks himself with a joylessness that was not cruelty, but was close enough to it that Eli, who was perceptive in the way of children who have lost something enormous, had started keeping his smaller troubles to himself. Thomas, who was younger, was more resilient or perhaps more oblivious, and he had continued to run toward his father with scraped knees and dead lizards, and excited observations about clouds with the relentlessness of a boy who had not yet learned that sometimes adults were somewhere else inside themselves. Clement had recognized dimly that something needed to change. Mrs. Callahan had made it less dim when she had taken him aside after Sunday services in July 1883 and told him plainly that Eli's shoes were 2 sizes too small, and Thomas had been wearing the same pair of pants to school for 3 weeks, and that Clara, God rest her, would have had something to say about that. He had driven to Tucson the following week and visited the Southwestern Domestic Agency, which placed women in households across the territory as housekeepers and domestic companions. He had felt deeply uncomfortable with the entire transaction, but had completed it because Mrs. Callahan was right, and he knew it. The woman they had sent him was Nora Ramsey, 27 years old, from Springfield, Missouri. Her file had said she was experienced with children, competent in all domestic skills, and came with a character reference from the First Presbyterian Church of Springfield that described her as hardworking, honest, and possessed of a calm temperament suited to difficult circumstances. The agency coordinator, a brisk woman named Mrs. Hollies, had added a handwritten note at the bottom of the file that said simply, "She is not looking for rescue. She is looking for work." Clement had appreciated that note more than he could explain. He had not asked what it meant. He had simply driven to the Tucson Stage Depot on the 15th of August, 1883, and waited. The woman who stepped off the stage was not what he had constructed in his imagination, though he could not have said precisely what he had constructed. She was medium height, dark-haired, with the kind of face that was not immediately striking, but became striking once you had spent 10 minutes in conversation with her because of the quality of attention she brought to it. She had gray eyes that were direct without being aggressive. She was carrying a single travel bag and a smaller satchel that he would later learn contained her sewing kit, her Bible, a dog-eared copy of Middlemark, and a photograph of her parents' house in Missouri that she kept face down at the bottom of the bag and did not take out. She had shaken his hand like a business associate and said, "Mr. Donovan, I'm Nora Ramsey. I appreciate you meeting me." He had said, "The wagon's this way," and carried her bag because it was the right thing to do, and neither of them had said much on the 2-hour drive back to the ranch because Clement was not a man who talked to fill silence, and Nora, it turned out, was not either. He had shown her to the small room off the kitchen that Clara had used as a sewing room and that he had converted hastily into a bedroom with a narrow iron bedstead, a washstand, and a chest of drawers. It was not luxurious. It was adequate. He had told her the terms of her employment, the wage, the hours, the expectations, and she had listened and asked 2 precise questions about the boys' schooling schedule and whether the kitchen was fully stocked. He had answered. She had said she would start in the morning. She had started in the morning. The first week had been a careful dance of professional boundaries, both of them mapping the terrain of the household with deliberate courtesy. Nora had cooked, cleaned, managed the laundry and the marketing in town, gotten Eli and Thomas organized for school with an efficiency that was impressive without being showy. The boys had been cautious at first. Thomas had warmed within 3 days, which surprised no one. Eli had taken longer, watching Nora with the careful watchfulness of a boy who had learned that adults in his life could disappear, testing her with small defiances to see how she would respond. Nora had responded with absolute consistency. She had not been strict in a way that frightened, or in a way that was soft enough to be meaningless. She had been clear and steady, like a fence line that did not waver in the wind, and Eli had gradually stopped testing and started trusting, and sometime around the end of the 2nd week, he had started talking to her about his mother in the careful, sideways way of children who are not sure if it is allowed. Nora had let him talk. She had not tried to replace or reframe or redirect. She had just listened and asked questions, and Eli had come away from those conversations looking lighter than he had in months. Clement had noticed all of this. He had noticed it from the careful distance he maintained, doing his best to keep himself behind the professional line he had drawn in his own mind. She was an employee. This was a business arrangement. He was grateful for her competence and nothing else. He had almost convinced himself that was true. Then came the morning in October when the October light was very blue and very still, and he had come in from checking on the cattle early, and he had walked into the kitchen and seen Nora sitting at the kitchen table with both his sons' Sunday shirts spread before her, needle moving with quiet precision, mending what had broken without being asked. He had stood in that doorway for a long time. When he rode back in from the fence line that morning, she was in the yard hanging the shirts to dry on the line strung between the porch post and the old cottonwood tree. The white cotton caught the late morning light and billowed softly in the October breeze. She had her back to him as he came through the gate, and he stood for a moment watching the ordinary, impossible beauty of it, the clean shirts on the line, the woman's hand smoothing a collar with a satisfied pat. She heard his horse and turned around, squinting into the light. "The shirts are mended," she said. "They'll be dry by afternoon if the wind keeps up." He dismounted and led the horse toward the barn and said, "Thank you," in a voice that came out more roughly than he intended, and he kept walking without meeting her eyes because meeting her eyes right now felt dangerous in a way he could not fully articulate. Nora watched him go and said nothing further because Nora Ramsey was perceptive, and she had noticed the roughness in his voice, and she was not sure what to do with it. She went back inside and started on the midday meal and told herself the same thing she had been telling herself for the past 2 months. This was employment. She was a professional. She was here to care for 2 boys and manage a household. And the fact that Clement Donovan had dark eyes and a way of being quiet that felt less like absence and more like depth was entirely beside the point. She was very good at telling herself things that were beside the point. Her ability to do so had been developed through necessity. Nora Ramsey had come west not purely for employment opportunity, though she told herself and others that was the whole of it. She had come west because Springfield, Missouri had become suffocating in the specific way that small towns become suffocating when they have decided what you are and refuse to let you be anything else. She had been engaged to a man named Robert Haley, who had been respected and prosperous, and who had, over the 2 years of their engagement, revealed himself to be the kind of man who believed that a woman's inner life was largely decorative. He had not been cruel in any dramatic way. He had simply been certain, with a certainty so complete it left no room for her, that he already knew everything about her that mattered. Their engagement had ended in March of 1882 when Nora had given him back the ring and explained, with the directness that she had inherited from her mother, that she could not marry a man who listened to her voice but never heard her words. Robert had been bewildered and then angry. Her parents had been mortified. The town had formed its collective opinion overnight, the way small towns do. She had spent the following year in Springfield being the woman who had ended a perfectly good engagement for incomprehensible reasons, the woman who was too particular, who had too many opinions, who read too much. The weight of it had pressed down on her steadily until it had become clear that staying meant becoming something smaller than herself, and she was not willing to do that. The agency advertisement had appeared in the Springfield newspaper in June of 1883. Domestic positions available in the Arizona Territory. Reliable Christian women sought. Experience with children preferred. She had read it 3 times, and then she had written to Mrs. Holly's, and 3 weeks later she had been on the stage to Tucson. She had not told herself she was running away. She had told herself she was running towards something, though she had been deliberately vague in her own mind about what that something was. She was beginning to suspect it might be the man who stood for a long time in doorways and then rode out into the desert trying to outrun his own feelings. She chopped the onions for the stew and told herself firmly to stop thinking about it. The next weeks passed in a tension that was so carefully maintained on both sides that it almost felt like calm. Clement was courteous and remote. He thanked her for meals. He asked appropriate questions about the boys' schoolwork. He fixed the loose board on the porch step she mentioned on a Thursday, and it was fixed by Friday morning. He paid her wages promptly on the 1st of the month and did not add sentiment to the envelope. But there were moments that cut through the courtesy like a seam ripper through fabric, clean and precise, and leaving everything open. There was the evening Thomas had a nightmare and woke crying at 3 in the morning. And Clement had gotten there first but had been standing in the boys' doorway uncertain, because Clement was good at many things and comfort was not one of them. And Nora had appeared behind him in her wrapper and had slipped past him and gathered Thomas up without hesitation. And Clement had watched from the doorway as she rocked the boy and told him that the dream was not real and the dark was not something to fear and his father was right here. And she had said it so naturally. His father is right here, including him in the comfort she was giving, and something had happened in Clement's chest that he had spent the rest of the night lying awake and unsuccessfully ignoring. There was the afternoon she had come out to the barn with coffee and had found him sitting on a hay bale with his hands between his knees and his head down, and she had set the coffee on the fence post without a word and turned to go, and he had said without planning to, "Her birthday was yesterday." And Nora had turned back and sat down on the hay bale across from him and said, "Clara's." And he had said, "Yes." And they had sat there for 20 minutes in a silence that was not empty at all, and she had not tried to fix it or fill it or make it into something instructive. She had just been present with him in it. And when he picked up the coffee cup, she stood and went back inside, and neither of them mentioned it afterward. There was the Sunday morning the week after, when he had come downstairs to find both boys already dressed and fed and their Sunday shirts, the mended ones, pressed smooth and hanging on the backs of their chairs. And Eli was sitting at the table finishing his oatmeal looking immaculate, and Thomas had oatmeal on his chin and was cheerfully unaware of it. And Nora was pouring coffee at the stove, and the morning light was coming through the kitchen window and laying across the floor in long golden bars. And Clement had stood in the kitchen doorway and thought, with a clarity so sharp it hurt, "This is what a home is supposed to feel like." He had gone to the barn and done unnecessary tasks for 30 minutes before he could trust himself to come back. In town, there were things being said, because in Harlow's Creek in 1883 there were always things being said. Mrs. Callahan was actually mostly positive about the arrangement, having been the one to suggest it, and she reported to anyone who asked that the Donovan boys looked better fed and better turned out than they had in 18 months, and that the widow Donovan's household was being kept with admirable decency. But there were others. A man named Gerald Prout, who ran the feed store and who had been mildly pursuing Nora since she had first come to town to shop at his establishment, was the primary architect of the alternative narrative. Gerald Prout had decided that a woman of Nora's age who had come west alone from Missouri must have a dark past of some kind, and he had elaborated this theory in various conversations at the saloon, with the inventive enthusiasm of a man whose actual life was less interesting than he wished. The stories that came back to Nora in fragments were unspecific but persistent. There had been a scandal in Missouri. There was a reason she had left. She was not what she appeared. Nora had heard versions of these rumors by the middle of October, from a well-meaning neighbor woman named Dorothea Marsh, who had come by the ranch ostensibly to drop off preserves and actually to warn her. And she had thanked Dorothea and put the preserves in the pantry and felt the familiar sick weight of it. Because this was not new. This was exactly the thing she had come west to escape. And finding it waiting for her here with a new face was dismaying in the way that only the truly predictable can be dismaying. She had not told Clement. She should have. She knew she should have. But Clement's good opinion of her was something she had started to value more than she entirely liked, and telling him would have required explaining the whole of it, the broken engagement, the reason, Robert Haley's bewildered anger, the town's verdict, the departure, and all of that felt too much like showing him the interior of herself before she was certain he was the kind of man who would treat what was shown to him with care. She was almost certain. She was not quite certain enough. Then Gerald Prout came to the ranch. He came on a Wednesday afternoon in late October, driving his wagon up the road with the specific confidence of a man who believed he was doing someone a favor by appearing. Nora was in the yard when he pulled up, bringing in the dried laundry from the line. She turned at the sound of wheels on the road and recognized him, and felt her shoulders tight with a specific professional wariness. Gerald Prout was perhaps 40, thick through the middle, with the permanently reddened complexion of a man who spent his afternoons in the sun and his evenings at the saloon. He was not a villain in any grand sense. He was simply a man who had decided Nora would be his and had not yet been persuaded otherwise in terms he respected. He climbed down from the wagon and tipped his hat and said, "Miss Ramsey, thought I'd come see how you're getting on out here. Must be lonely being all the way out here with just a widower and 2 boys." Nora said, "I am getting on fine, Mr. Prout. What can I do for you?" He said several things that were conversationally unremarkable, but that contained within them the unmistakable architecture of a campaign. He was a man of property. He had a fine house in town. There were better situations for a woman of her quality than domestic service on a hardscrabble ranch. He made it sound like he was offering rescue, which meant he believed she needed rescuing, which meant he believed she was in some kind of trap. Nora, who was not in a trap, kept the laundry basket on her hip and maintained the expression she had developed for exactly this kind of conversation, politely attentive, giving nothing, until Gerald Prout had exhausted his repertoire and left. She went back inside and was hanging the laundry in the utility room when she heard Clement's boots on the porch. He came through the door and said without preamble, "What did Prout want?" She turned and looked at him. His jaw was set in a way that meant he had seen more of the conversation than she had realized. She said, "He was suggesting I would be better positioned in a different household." Clement looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "He's been spreading stories about you in town." The way he said it, flat and factual, and with something carefully controlled underneath the flatness, told her he had already known and had not brought it to her, perhaps for the same reasons she had not brought it to him. She said, "I heard something of that." He said, "It's not true whatever he's saying." She met his eyes and said, "No, it isn't." They stood in the utility room with the half-hung laundry between them and neither of them looked away, and the thing that had been building in the space between them for 2 months was suddenly present and undeniable, like a fire that has been banked carefully under ash and has been quietly growing all along. Clement cleared his throat. He said, "I'll speak to him." She said, "I can handle my own affairs, Mr. Donovan." He said, "I know you can." A pause. He said, "I'm going to speak to him anyway." She felt the corner of her mouth move in a way she controlled and looked back at the laundry. She said, "That's your decision to make." He went back out and she heard his boots on the porch again, and she stood with a sheet half folded in her hands and thought, "Oh, this is a problem." Clement drove to town the following morning. He found Gerald Pruitt at the feed store, behind the counter in the middle of serving a farmer, and he waited with the particular quality of patience that large, controlled men achieve when they are very angry, until the farmer had been served and had gone. Then he said quietly, "I want to be clear about something, Gerald." Gerald Pruitt, who was not stupid, understood from Clement's tone that this was going to be a specific kind of conversation. He said, "I don't know what you've heard, Clement." Clement said, "I've heard enough. Whatever you've been saying about Miss Ramsey in the saloon or anywhere else, I want it to stop. She is an honest woman doing honest work in my household, and she has not done a thing to merit the kind of talk you've been putting around." Gerald Pruitt's reddened face went a shade darker. He said, "I was just remarking on what I observed." Clement said, "You were remarking on what you imagined." There is a difference, and in a territory where a woman's reputation is about the only protection she has, a man who chips away at it without cause is doing something that I find very difficult to look at charitably. He let that sit for a moment. Then he said, "I hope we understand each other." Gerald Pruitt said they understood each other, with the stiff dignity of a man who is embarrassed and will process that embarrassment into resentment later, but who is not, at present, inclined to push back against 6 feet of granite-jawed Irish rancher. Clement walked back out into the sunlight and stood on the boardwalk for a moment with his hands in his pockets, looking down the dusty main street of Harlow's Creek, and thought about what he had just done. He had just defended Nora Ramsey with more heat than a man would defend an employee. He was thinking about that, turning it over when Mrs. Callahan appeared at his elbow with her shopping basket. She said, "I saw you come out of Pruitt's. Did you give him what for?" Clement said, "I spoke to him plainly." Mrs. Callahan said, "Good. That man has been talking nonsense and somebody needed to address it." She patted Clement's arm with the brisk approval of a woman who had known him for years and had strong opinions about the direction his life should take. She said, "She's a good woman, Clement. Anyone with eyes can see that." He said, "Yes." Mrs. Callahan gave him a look that was entirely too shrewd and said, "Well then," and walked away. He drove back to the ranch with the October sun on his face and Gerald Pruitt's chastened expression in his memory, and Mrs. Callahan's well then ringing in his ears. And he thought about Nora at the kitchen table in the blue morning light, the needle moving through white cotton, mending what had broken. He thought about her sitting across from him in the barn in the hay-smelling silence of Clara's birthday, not trying to fix anything, just present. He thought about the way she had gathered Thomas up in the night and said his father is right here, giving him back to his son without making it into anything. He gripped the reins and told the horse to move along. He was in very serious trouble. He did not know that back at the ranch, Nora was also engaged in a reckoning of her own. She had been sitting at the kitchen table with her Bible open in front of her, but she had not been reading it. She had been staring at the page while her mind produced a clear and unwelcome inventory. She was in danger of doing something foolish. She was in danger of caring about this household, specifically about its owner, in a way that was not professional and not contractual and not safe. She had come west to escape the suffocation of being pinned into a role that left no room for her actual self, and she was afraid now of a different kind of trap, the trap of wanting something she could not be certain she could have, of letting herself be seen by a man who might look right past what she showed him, or worse, who might see it all and still not be ready. Clement Donovan was not over his grief. She knew this the way she knew most things about him. not from what he said, but from what lived in the spaces around what he said. He was still in the house with Clara in some essential way, still moving around the rooms of his loss with the careful, disciplined tread of a man who has decided not to disturb anything. She did not want to be a replacement. She did not want to be a solution to loneliness or a consolation. She wanted, if she was honest, to be wanted for exactly who she was, in the same direct and whole way that she had always wanted things, which was the quality that Robert Haley had called too particular, and which Nora considered non-negotiable. She was staring at this dilemma, balanced on the fine edge between caution and want, when Eli came home from school. He came in through the kitchen door with his school bag over his shoulder and the specific high color of a boy who had been in some kind of altercation, and he dropped his bag on the kitchen floor and stood there with his jaw set in a way that made him look exactly like his father. Nora closed her Bible and said, "Sit down and tell me what happened." He sat. He told her. There had been a boy at school, a boy named Lawrence Prout, who was Gerald Prout's son, who had said something in the schoolyard that Eli did not want to repeat verbatim, but that had been about Nora, something from his father that had come out of Lawrence Prout's mouth in the schoolyard like a flung stone. Eli had responded with his fist. Nora felt several things at once. She felt protective fury on behalf of this boy who had defended her. She felt the weight of what Gerald Prout had chosen to do, bringing his campaign to the schoolyard through his son. She felt the old familiar heaviness of being the subject of rumors, and underneath it all she felt something sharp and clear. She was tired of it. She was bone tired of carrying the weight of other people's need to diminish her. She looked at Eli, who was watching her with his father's dark eyes and the expectant tension of a boy waiting to find out if he had done the right thing. She said, "I appreciate that you defended me. That was kind. But fighting is not the answer, and you know that, and I think you also know that your father is going to have something to say about it when he comes home." Eli said, "Lawrence Prout was lying. What he said wasn't true." Nora said, "No, it wasn't, and that matters, but there are ways to address lies that don't end with someone's bloody nose." Eli looked at his hands. He said you were going to leave. He said his pa said you wouldn't stay and that you were the kind of woman who doesn't stay." The room got very quiet. Nora sat with that for a moment, looking at this 8-year-old boy who had just revealed in the plainest possible terms that the question of her leaving was something he had been carrying in secret worry. She leaned forward and put her hand on the table near his. She said, "Eli, I'm not planning to leave. I like it here. I like you and your brother very much, and I think Harlow's Creek suits me." She paused. Then she said, "But I want you to hear me say something important. Things in life are not always fully certain. I cannot promise you that nothing will ever change. What I can promise you is that I would tell you if I were planning to go, and I would not just disappear. Do you understand the difference?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes." She said, "Good. Now go wash your hands and do your schoolwork before your father gets home, and we have to explain both the fighting and the incomplete arithmetic." He went, and Nora sat at the kitchen table and looked at the space where he had been and thought, oh, she was in very serious trouble. Clement came home an hour later. He listened to the account of the schoolyard with the set jaw and the controlled eyes that were his version of contained emotion, and he had a conversation with Eli that Nora was not present for, after which Eli came out of the parlor looking slightly chastened but not devastated, which meant Clement had managed it right. At supper, the table was quieter than usual. After the boys had been put to bed, Clement came back down to the kitchen where Nora was finishing the washing up. He stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "I talked to Prout this morning. I didn't account for him taking it to his boy." Nora dried her hands on the dish towel and said, "You don't need to account for what other people do with their spite." He said, "I feel responsible." She turned and looked at him. She said, "Why?" He said, "Because you are in this household under my name, and what happens to you here is partly my responsibility. That's not sentiment, that's just fact." She looked at him for a long moment and then said carefully, "Is it purely fact?" The question sat between them like something thrown into still water. Clement's jaw worked. He looked at the floor and then back at her and he said, "Nora," she said. "Yes," he said. "I don't know how to do this carefully enough." She said, "I don't think careful is always the right approach." He let out a breath that was almost a sound. He said, "I think about you more than I should. I'm aware that it is not appropriate given the arrangement we have. I'm telling you this because I have spent my whole life not saying things I should have said, and I am tired of it, and also because Eli hit someone today on your behalf, and I think whatever is happening in this household deserves to be looked at plainly." Nora set the dish towel on the counter. She said, "You think I haven't been thinking about you?" He looked at her. She said, "I have been sitting in that room off the kitchen for 2 months talking myself out of it every single night, Mr. Donovan. I came west to make something real. I came west because I had spent years being told I was too much of something or not enough of something else, and I was not interested in marrying a man who thought of me as a pleasant household fixture." She held his gaze. "But I am also not interested in being a consolation prize or a convenient solution. If you are thinking about me because you are lonely, then you need to be honest with yourself about that, and with me." Clement took 2 steps across the kitchen and stopped a foot away from her. He said quietly, "That is not why I'm thinking about you." She said, "Then why?" he said. "Because you sat in the barn with me on Clara's birthday and did not try to fix anything. Because you tell my boys the truth in ways that don't frighten them. Because you found the shirts at the bottom of the laundry basket and mended them without being asked, and without making it into something, without needing credit for it, just because they needed to be done. Because every time I look at you I think there is someone here who sees the actual world, not the world as she wishes it were." He paused. "I am still grieving. I will not pretend I am not. But I am also certain of the difference between grief and this is not grief." Nora stood very still. Then she said, "That is a very good answer," he said. "I have been working on it for about 2 months." She felt the laugh come out of her before she could prevent it, and his mouth moved, a real movement, the closest thing to a smile she had seen on that controlled face in all the weeks she had been here, and something between them shifted like a door finally opening. He said, "I'm not asking you to change what you are in this house. I'm asking if you would consider changing what we are to each other. Slowly, carefully," she said. "I thought you said careful wasn't always right." He said, "You said that," she said. "I know, but you were agreeing." He looked at her. The November moon was coming through the kitchen window and laying silver across the floor, and she was standing in her work dress with her hands clasped in front of her and her gray eyes steady and clear. And Clement Donovan thought he had never seen anything so exactly right in his life. He said, "Would you walk with me on Sunday afternoon?" She said, "Yes." That was how it began. Not with a declaration or a kiss or anything dramatic. It began with a question and a yes, and the October night through the kitchen window, and 2 people who had both spent too long being sensible finally allowing themselves to be something else. They walked on Sunday afternoon. The landscape south of Harlow's Creek in November was not conventionally romantic. It was all high desert, thin soil over rock, the cactus and the mesquite and the wash running dry between rough banks, the mountains going blue and purple in the distance, the sky enormous and the air carrying the first edge of winter cold. But Nora found it beautiful in the same way she found honest things beautiful, not because it was decorated, but because it was itself. They walked out past the barn and along the dry wash and up toward the ridge where the view opened up to show the whole valley, and they talked. They talked with a freedom that surprised both of them, because they had been in each other's company every day for months and had talked carefully about practical things. And now they were talking without the careful, and everything was different. He told her about Ireland, the passage over, Patrick dying in New Mexico before Clement got there, the mule named Abraham. She told him about Springfield, the broken engagement, not defensively but as a fact, explaining Robert Haley without making him a villain because he was not really a villain, just a man who had been too small. Clement listened with his hands in his jacket pockets and his eyes on the middle distance and asked one question when she was finished. "Did you ever love him?" She considered it honestly. She said, "I loved the idea of what I thought we could be. I did not love him. I think I knew that and did not admit it until it was almost too late." He said, "It wasn't too late." She said, "No, it wasn't." He told her about Clara. He told her quietly and without performance, the way a man talks about something that has become part of him, something he carries the way you carry a stone in your pocket, aware of its weight at all times. He said she had been his best friend in the full sense of the word. He said losing her had been like losing his north, and that he had spent 18 months navigating by something else, something colder and less reliable. He said the boys had kept him from going entirely under. She said, "She sounds like someone worth loving." He said, "She was." A pause. The wind moved through the mesquite. He said, "I think you are too." She looked at him. He was looking straight ahead, jaw set with the expression she now recognized as Clement's version of vulnerability, the locked look he wore when he had said something that cost him. She said, "So do I," and because she did not want him to think she meant only herself, she added, "Think you are worth loving." He turned and looked at her, and for a moment the controlled face was simply open, and she saw everything in it that he kept behind the walls, the grief and the steadiness and the capacity for feeling that he had decided was dangerous, and she thought, "There you are." They walked back in the early dark, and Eli and Thomas were waiting on the porch steps, and Thomas shouted, "Papa," and launched himself off the step, and Clement caught him with one arm, still looking at Nora over the boy's head, and Nora went up the porch steps and ruffled Eli's hair, and he leaned into her hand for one brief second before pulling away with dignity, and she thought, this is what she had been running toward when she left Springfield on the stage with her single bag and her sewing kit and her face-down photograph. This. The weeks that followed were a transformation so gradual and so complete that neither of them could have pointed to the exact moment when the professional arrangement became something else entirely. It was not a single threshold. It was a series of small surrenders. It was Clement sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings after the boys were in bed, reading the newspaper while Nora did her mending, and neither of them feeling the need to fill the quiet or leave it. It was the evening she showed him the face-down photograph of her parents' house and told him why she kept it face-down, not because she was ashamed of it, but because looking at it too often made the wanting of home sharper than she could always afford. He had held the photograph and looked at it carefully and asked about the elm tree in the yard, and she had told him her father had planted it when she was 3, and he had handed it back and said nothing. But the next day there had been a small sapling planted by the kitchen garden, which was much too late in the year for planting and would probably not survive the winter, and she had looked at it for a long time before she went back inside. It was Thomas asking one evening at supper if Nora was going to live with them forever, and the table going very quiet, and Clement meeting Nora's eyes across the soup bowls, and the candlelight with a look that was a question and an answer both, and Nora saying, with perfect steadiness, "I hope to stay a very long time, Thomas," and Clement's hand on the table relaxing from a grip she had not known was a grip. It was Eli showing her his drawings, careful, precise drawings he had been doing in secret in a sketchbook, horses and landscapes, and a surprising portrait of his father from the back, the set of the shoulders, the hat, the particular way Clement stood when he was looking at the mountains. She had looked at each drawing seriously and told him he had a real gift for seeing, and he had colored up with pleasure and tucked the sketchbook back under his mattress as if it were precious cargo. It was December coming and the temperature dropping, and Clement repairing the stovepipe in the bedroom off the kitchen without being asked, because he had heard her coughing in the cold morning air and had identified the draft that was causing it and corrected it before she mentioned it, and she had thought, so that is what it feels like when it goes both ways. On Christmas Eve they were all together in the kitchen making the spiced cookies that Clement said Clara had always made for Christmas, and the recipe for which was written in Clara's handwriting in the cookbook on the shelf. And Nora had taken the cookbook down and read the recipe aloud and used it without comment. and Clement had stood in the kitchen and watched his boys covered in flour and laughing, while the smell of cinnamon filled the house, and the expression on his face was one she had never seen before. Uncomplicated happiness. Thomas fell asleep on the parlor floor at 9 o'clock and Clement carried him to bed, and Eli went up shortly after and Nora was tidying the kitchen when Clement came back down. He stood in the kitchen doorway. He said, "Merry Christmas, Nora," she said. "Merry Christmas, Clement." He crossed the kitchen in the same way he had crossed it that night in October, 2 deliberate steps that closed the distance between intention and action, and he took her hand. He said, "I have been trying to think of how to say something to you, and I keep finding that I don't have the right words," she said. "Then don't use words." He leaned down and kissed her carefully, seriously, with a quality of attention that she recognized as specifically his, the way he did everything, completely present, nothing held back once he had decided. She kissed him back with the same honesty she brought to everything, no performance, no coyness, just yes. When they separated, the kitchen was very quiet and the stove was popping and the cinnamon smell was still in the air. He said, "I am going to need to think about what comes next." She said, "So am I," he said. "I would like it to involve you staying." She said, "I am not opposed to that." He smiled, the full version, and she thought she would commit the sight of it to memory because it felt like something she wanted to have always. January in Cochise County was cold in the clear, brilliant way of the desert, the cold that came with light instead of clouds, and the ranch was busy with the work of winter. The cattle needed more tending. The water troughs needed breaking every morning. Clement was out before dawn most days and back at dusk, and the evenings were the real territory of their courtship, those hours after supper and before sleep when the house belonged to the two of them, and the conversation between them had opened into something wide and real. He told her things he had not told anyone. She told him things she had not told anyone. She told him about the night she had given Robert Haley his ring back, the specific way he had looked at her, not hurt but uncomprehending, as if she were speaking a language he had no access to. She told him she had felt guilty about his incomprehension for months before she understood that she was not responsible for the limitation. He told her about the night Clara died, sitting beside the bed holding her hand in the dark, and how he had said everything he wanted to say and she had heard it all, and how that was both a consolation and a sorrow. A consolation because there was nothing left unsaid. A sorrow because he was going to be living with everything said in a world where she was no longer there to say new things to. Nora sat across from him in the lamplight with her hands folded in her lap and said, "She gave you something that most people never get, complete." He said, "Yes, she did." He looked at Nora. He said, "I want that again." "Not the same thing. I know it cannot be the same thing. I am not asking for the same thing. But complete. Real," she said. "So do I," he said. "Then let me ask you something properly." She looked at him. He said, "I am asking you not as an employer and not as a man who is lonely or a man who is looking for a replacement for something he lost. I am asking you as someone who has been watching you for 4 months and finds that every day he sees more of you, and every day he thinks here is someone I could spend my life trying to be worthy of." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a ring, a simple one, a band of silver with a small turquoise stone, not a grand jeweler's piece but clearly chosen, clearly specific. He said, "I know the circumstances are unusual and I know you have reason to be cautious about the institution of marriage. I am not asking you to stop being careful. I am asking you to be careful about this with me." She looked at the ring. She looked at him. She thought of the sapling he had planted too late in the season outside the kitchen garden, and the shirts on the line, and the way he had stood in the doorway of Thomas's room uncertain until she had come and given him back his son. She said, "Yes." He put the ring on her finger and sat back with the look of a man who has just had something returned to him that he had stopped believing he would see again, and she thought she might need a moment. They told the boys in the morning. Thomas immediately wanted to know if this meant Nora was going to be his mother, and looked ready to combust with enthusiasm, waiting for the answer. Eli was quieter, watching Nora with that careful old gaze, and she met it steadily. She said, "I am not going to try to be your mother, Eli. Your mother was Clara, and she will always be that, and nothing changes that." She paused. "But I would very much like to be someone you can count on, someone who is here." She held his gaze. "If that would be acceptable to you." Eli was very still for a long moment. Then he said, "I think Mama would have liked you." Clement made a sound low in his throat and looked at the window. Nora said, "That is the kindest thing you could have said to me." "Thank you, Eli." Thomas, who had been waiting with volcanic patience, erupted with, "So she is going to stay forever." And when Clement said yes, Thomas performed a victory lap around the kitchen table that ended with him colliding with the doorframe and declaring himself fine. They were married on a Friday in February, 1884, in the small church in Harlow's Creek, by Reverend Calvert, who had known Clement for 10 years, and who had conducted Clara's funeral, and who performed the ceremony with the particular gentleness of a man who understood what this second marriage cost, and what it was worth. Mrs. Callahan was there, occupying the front pew and managing to convey simultaneous pride in having predicted this outcome and humility about taking credit. Dorothea Marsh and her husband attended. Several of the neighboring ranchers came. The boys were in their Sunday shirts, both mended, both pressed, and Eli stood very straight, and Thomas had a smudge on his chin that Nora had not noticed until the vows were being said, and she decided it was perfect. Clement stood at the front of the church and watched Nora walk toward him down the narrow aisle in her good blue dress, and he thought he was a man who had been given something he had not known how to ask for. When the Reverend asked her to state her intention to take this man, she looked straight at Clement and said, "I do," with a directness that made Mrs. Callahan press her handkerchief to her mouth. That night, after the boys were in bed and the celebratory supper had been cleared and the neighbors had gone home and the house was quiet, Clement and Nora stood on the front porch in the February cold and looked at the stars, which in the Arizona high desert are an abundance of light so extravagant it seems impossible. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and he said, "Thank you for not running away when I was being impossible." She said, "You were never impossible. You were just a man who did not believe yet that he was allowed to have something good." He said, "I believe it now." She said, "I know." The spring of 1884 brought everything at once. It brought the calving season, which was always a gauntlet of exhausted nights and cold mornings, and Nora learned more about the operation of a cattle ranch than she had anticipated and found that she did not mind. She had been useful in Missouri, and she was useful here, and the work was good in the same fundamental way that work always is when it is real. It brought a resolution to the problem of Gerald Prout, who had continued to be a peripheral nuisance until the spring, when he made the error of repeating some version of his stories about Nora in Mrs. Callahan's hearing. Mrs. Callahan had addressed him in terms that were brief, precise, and apparently so withering that he had not spoken Nora Donovan's name publicly since. Nora, when she heard this, had sent Mrs. Callahan a jar of the cherry preserves she had put up in March and considered the matter closed. It brought a letter from Nora's mother in Springfield, carefully worded, plainly confused about the speed of events, asking questions about Clement that Nora answered honestly and at length, describing the ranch and the boys and the man with the same directness she brought to all communication. A second letter arrived in April that was warmer, tentative in the way of a woman who is revising her understanding of a situation, asking whether a visit might be possible in the summer. Nora had taken the letter out to the barn where Clement was working and read it to him, and he had looked up from the harness he was repairing and said, "Tell her to come," with the simple generosity of a man who understood that families were worth the complications they brought. It brought, in May, the knowledge that she was carrying their child. She told Clement in the evening, at the kitchen table, in the practical, direct way she did most things. She said, "I believe we are going to have another child." He was very still for a moment. Then he looked up from the newspaper and she saw his face do the thing it did when he was in the presence of something large and good, the barely contained openness, the evidence of a man whose emotional depth was not shallow but was very carefully housed. He said, "Are you well?" She said, "I am perfectly well." He said, "And you are certain?" She said, "I spoke with Dr. Hensley on Thursday. He confirms it." He was quiet for a moment longer. Then he stood up from the table and came around to her side and crouched down beside her chair and took her hand. He said, "Nora." She said, "Yes." He said, "I did not think I was allowed to want this." She put her other hand over his and said, "You are. We both are." The boys received the news of an impending sibling with characteristic difference. Thomas announced to anyone who would listen in town, at school, at the neighbor's fence, that there was a baby coming and it was going to be the best thing. Eli asked Nora privately if she was going to be all right. She told him she was going to be very all right, and he looked relieved and went back to his sketchbook with the air of a boy who has checked an important item off an internal list. The summer of 1884 was a season of growing. The ranch grew. Clement had been cautious with the additional acreage for years, not wanting to overextend, but with Nora managing the household accounts with the competence she brought to everything, he could see more clearly what the operation could sustain, and they expanded the herd carefully and profitably. The family grew. Nora's mother, Helen Ramsey, arrived in June on the stage from Tucson, a small, precise woman who looked at her daughter's settled face and her straight back, and the way she moved through her own house with complete assurance, and visibly revised whatever worry she had carried all the way from Springfield. She looked at Clement and he looked at her, and after one long dinner during which Mrs. Helen Ramsey asked careful questions that barely concealed their nature as an assessment, and Clement answered every one of them honestly, Helen Ramsey said, "You take good care of my daughter," and it was not quite a question. Clement said, "I try. She takes excellent care of herself. I try to be worthy of being in the vicinity." Helen Ramsey had laughed, genuinely surprised, and something between them that had been formal became easier. The boys grew. Eli turned 9 in August, and Thomas turned 7 in September, and Thomas lost 2 teeth and grew an inch, and declared himself the tallest person in the family, which was demonstrably false, but which everyone allowed on the grounds that his enthusiasm was more important than accuracy. Eli's drawings got more intricate. He did a portrait of Nora at the kitchen table that was so precisely observed that Clement had looked at it for a long time before asking if he could have it. He framed it and hung it in the parlor, and Eli had gone scarlet with pride and the effort of not showing it. Nora's pregnancy proceeded without complication, which she had been assured was the likely outcome, and which she trusted while being aware of what could go wrong, as all women in 1884 Arizona were aware, because the frontier did not insulate you from the knowledge of how fragile things could be. In late October, with the first anniversary of the morning she had mended the shirts approaching without either of them having marked it in speech, Clement came in from the morning work to find Nora at the kitchen table. She was mending a shirt. It was one of Eli's, a different one, not a Sunday shirt, just an everyday shirt with a torn seam at the shoulder. She was bent over it with the same concentrated quietness of that first morning, needle moving, the morning light across the kitchen floor. He stopped in the doorway. He stood there for a long time. She looked up and saw him, and the expression on her face shifted to the particular warmth it had taken on in the months since February, open and certain, nothing hidden. She said, "You are standing in the doorway again." He said, "I seem to do that." She said, "I notice." He said, "I know you notice." He came across the kitchen and sat down in the chair beside her, and put his elbow on the table and watched her work. She let him watch without self-consciousness, the needle moving through the fabric with the same reliable patience that she brought to everything. After a while he said, "Do you know it has been a year since the first time I stood in that doorway and watched you do this?" She said, "I know." He said, "I was terrified." She set the shirt down and looked at him. She said, "I know that too." he said. I stood in the hallway for a full minute after, pressing my head against the wall. She raised an eyebrow. She said, how very dramatic, he said. You have no idea. I went and rode the fence line for 3 hours at 6 in the morning to avoid thinking about you, she said. And did it work? He said, what do you think? She laughed, the warm, full laugh that he had decided was one of the 3 best sounds in the world, alongside his boys calling him home and the rain on the roof of the house he had built. He reached across and took her hand, the one not holding the needle, and turned it over and looked at the turquoise ring. He said, I want to tell you something. She said, tell me. He said, when I stood in that doorway the first time. The thing that undid me was not just the act of it, the mending. It was the understanding that you had looked at what was broken in this house and had simply, quietly, started fixing it. Without announcement. Without asking for something in return. Just because it needed doing. He paused. I have spent a lot of my life feeling like I was the only one looking at what needed doing and doing it. I had never had someone beside me in it, someone who saw the same things I saw and just acted on them. He looked at her. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? She said. I think so. He said, what I am saying is that you showed me what it looks like when someone is truly with you. Not near you, not pleasant to be around, not convenient. With you, he squeezed her hand. I did not know I was waiting for that until I saw it. The room was very still. The stove made its quiet sound. Outside, the October light was doing what October light in Arizona does, turning the desert gold and copper, the kind of light that made the hard country look like something worth fighting for. She said, I came here with a face-down photograph and a sewing kit and a great deal of stubbornness, and I did not know exactly what I was hoping for. She turned her hand in his and held it properly. But I think I was hoping for someone who saw me the same way I see him. All of it. The whole of it. She looked at him steadily. You do, he said. Yes, she said, I know. They sat at the kitchen table in the October morning holding hands while the shirt with the mended seam lay between them, and neither of them said anything more because it was all said. Their son was born in November, the 14th, which was a cold, clear night with the stars out in abundance and the mountains visible in the moonlight, all silver and still. He was born with black hair and a remarkably indignant expression at being evicted from comfort, and Dr. Hensley declared him healthy and substantial, which he was. Nora was fine. She was more than fine. She was luminous with the particular radiance of exhausted women who have just done something enormous. And Clement sat beside her with her hand in both of his, and looked at his son in the crook of her arm, and thought he was not a man who had words for this, and was grateful there were none required. They named him Patrick, for Clement's brother who had died in New Mexico before Clement had gotten there, the man for whom the whole long westward journey had originally been undertaken, the man who had never seen this land or this family or this house with its mended shirts and its planted sapling. The sapling, remarkably, had survived the winter. It had leafed out thin and determined in the spring, and by November it was a small but definite tree. Thomas came to the door of the room and peered in with enormous eyes and whispered, Is that the baby? Nora said. That is the baby. His name is Patrick. Thomas came in and stood beside the bed and looked at the baby with the serious assessment of a 7-year-old who is revising the world's possibilities. He said, He is very small. Clement said, You were smaller. Thomas found this information astonishing and required several minutes to process. Eli came in behind his brother and stood at the foot of the bed and looked at Nora first and then at the baby and then at his father, taking the measure of this new configuration with his quiet, careful eyes. Then he said, He looks like Papa. Clement said, You think so? Eli said, The expression, like he's deciding something. Nora laughed and winced at the same time, and Clement said to the boys, Give her rest, and ushered them out with a hand on each shoulder. And in the doorway he turned and looked at her, and she looked at him, and it was the same look that had been building between them since October of the previous year, since a morning with a needle and white cotton and a long silence in a doorway, and it was full of everything. He closed the door quietly, and the room was hers and Patrick's, and she held her son in the November night and listened to the house settle around her, the boys' voices down the hall, the creak of Clement's boots on the stairs, the stove's warmth rising through the floors, and she thought, "This is real, this is mine, this is exactly enough." The years after that were the years of the work and the weather and the growing. Patrick grew. By 2, he was running at full speed in all directions with the exhausting commitment of a boy who seems to generate his own momentum. And Thomas, who had considered himself the small one for his entire life, took enormous satisfaction in now being definitively the middle and not the youngest, and exercised this status with unreasonable enthusiasm. Eli at 12 was working beside his father on the ranch in the way that boys do when the work is real, and the man they are working beside is someone they want to be. He had not stopped drawing. He had a new sketchbook every year, ordered from the dry goods catalog, and the drawings in them were getting more accomplished, more detailed, capturing the specific quality of light in the valley, the faces of the horses, his father's hands, his stepmother's profile in the kitchen window. Nora had written to her mother every week since arriving in Arizona and had visited Springfield with Clement and the boys in the summer of 1885, a journey of 2 days by stage to Tucson and then by rail, and her parents had welcomed them with the cautious warmth of people who are revising a long-held worry and finding the revision better than expected. Her father had shaken Clement's hand twice and spent an afternoon showing him the Missouri farm with the pride of a man who wanted to be seen, and Clement had seen it, had asked real questions about the soil and the crops, and her father had come away from the visit, saying that Clement Donovan was a man of substance, which was her father's highest praise, and which her mother relayed in a letter with palpable satisfaction. On the second anniversary of their marriage, in February 1886, Clement did not give Nora a gift. What he did was take her out to the kitchen garden on a cold, clear Saturday morning while the boys were occupied with various activities and show her the sapling which had grown to a tree of considerable dignity and self-possession, its bare winter branches reaching up into the blue Arizona sky. He said, "I planted it in October of 1883. I know it was the wrong time of year." She said, "I know you planted it." He said, "I know you know." She said, "You planted it because of the elm tree in my parents' yard." He said, "Yes." She stood looking at the tree for a moment. She said, "What kind is it?" He said, "Arizona walnut. I thought it should be something that belonged here." She turned and looked at him. She said, "You are very good at things you claim to have no words for." He said, "I have you to interpret." She took his arm and leaned against him, and they stood in the February cold looking at the walnut tree, and it was not a grand gesture, and it was not a dramatic moment, and it was exactly right. In the spring of 1886, Nora discovered she was carrying again. She told Clement at the kitchen table in the evening, and he received it the same way he had received everything since January of 1884, with the open face of a man who has stopped believing that goodness is something he has to brace against. The child born in November of that year was a daughter. She was born with Nora's dark hair and Clement's jaw, and an expression of extreme alertness that Eli said made her look like she was already noting things. They named her Clara Ruth, the first name for the woman who had loved this house first and the second for Nora's grandmother in Missouri. And when Clement wrote the name in the family Bible in his careful, seldom used handwriting, Nora put her hand over his, and they sat with the weight and sweetness of it for a while. Thomas, on being presented with a sister, announced that this was also acceptable. Patrick, who was nearly 2, announced that the baby had taken his spot and spent 3 days staging a diplomatic protest before being charmed out of it by the fact that Clara Ruth's hand, when he put his finger into it, gripped him back with a strength that he found both alarming and compelling. Eli drew her portrait when she was 3 days old. It was the best thing he had ever drawn. Clement had it framed and hung it beside the portrait of Nora in the parlor. The winter of 1886 into 1887 was a season of consolidation, a word Clement used when talking about the ranch, and which Nora privately applied to the inner life of the family, all of them settling into the shape of what they were, the specific gravity of 5 people in a house that had found its full weight. She organized the house with the completeness of someone who has stopped keeping one foot at the door. She planted a kitchen garden that in the spring would have tomatoes and squash, and the herbs she had been growing in pots on the windowsill since her first autumn. She finished hemming the parlor curtain she had been working on for 6 months, a project that had been interrupted by various children, animals, and weather events, and hung them on a Tuesday afternoon and stood back and looked at them with the satisfaction of a person who has completed a long work. Clement came in that evening and looked at the curtains. He said, "Those look well," she said. "They took 6 months." He said, "I know," she said. "You never said anything about it." He said, "I could see you were getting to it." She looked at him and thought, there it is, that was the thing. The thing she had known in the barn on Clara's birthday, the thing she had felt when he planted the wrong season sapling, the thing that had been in the doorway on the October morning with the shirts. He saw what was in progress and trusted it to be completed. He did not rush. He did not push. He looked at what was happening and believed in it. She said, "I love you." He said, "I know." And then, because he could not help himself and because he was not a man who left things unsaid when they could be said, "I love you, Nora, completely." She crossed the room and kissed him in the parlor with the new curtains behind them and the evening light coming through them, and the house quiet around them for this one still moment before the children reassembled from their various activities, and the evening resumed its productive chaos. In 1887, Gerald Prout moved his operation to Bisbee, which was growing fast with the copper mining and offered him better prospects. He was not missed. His son Lawrence had left the school in Harlow's Creek the previous year. The whole matter had become simply part of the history of the place, something that had happened and been resolved and passed, the way most things pass when you are busy building something real. Dorothea Marsh had become a genuine friend to Nora in the way that neighbors become friends in the territory, through proximity and shared difficulty, and the gradual discovery of real compatibility. They had a standing arrangement on Thursday afternoons when Nora would go to Dorothea's house or Dorothea would come to the ranch, and they would drink coffee and talk with the freedom that women of their time and place had in each other's company that was not always available elsewhere. Clement understood this friendship as a valuable thing and managed Thursday afternoon logistics accordingly, with the understated competence of a man who pays attention. Mrs. Callahan, who was the social conscience of Harlow's Creek and had been since before anyone could remember, pronounced herself satisfied with the outcome of events at the Donovan Ranch in terms that suggested she had personally engineered it. Nobody corrected her. She was not wrong in the ways that mattered. Eli Donovan turned 13 in the spring of 1888 and was by that age a young man of striking character, serious and observant and capable, with his mother Clara's honey-colored hair going dark, and his father's build beginning to emerge in his shoulders. He had decided, with the quiet certainty of someone who had known something for a long time and was simply now articulating it, that he wanted to be an artist. Not a working artist in the sense available to him in Cochise County, but a real one, the kind he had read about in the books Nora found for him on her trips to Tucson. He brought this to Nora first, not his father. He came to her in the kitchen on a Saturday morning and laid his sketchbook on the table and said, "I need to tell you something." And she sat down and looked at him and listened while he explained with careful precision what he wanted, what it would require, what he was afraid of. She listened to all of it. Then she said, "You should tell your father." Eli said, "He needs me here." Nora said, "He needs you to be who you are. That is not the same thing as needing you here." She paused. "Your father is not a man who will want you to make yourself smaller for his convenience. You know him well enough to know that." Eli looked at the sketchbook. He said, "What if he says no?" She said, "Talk to him first and find out what he actually says before you grieve over the answer." Eli talked to his father. Clement sat with it for 2 days and then came to Nora on the third evening and said, "What do you think?" she said. "I think he has a real gift. I think if you keep him here because it is easier for the ranch, you will lose a piece of him eventually. And I think you would rather have all of him at a distance than a smaller version of him underfoot." Clement was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There is a school in Tucson." She said, "Yes, I looked into it." He looked at her. He said, "Of course you did." She said, "He is 13. He wouldn't go for another 2 years at least. There is time to plan for it." He said, "He could board during the term and come home in the summers." She said, "Yes." He sat with that for another minute. Then he said, "You are right. I know you are right." He paused. "I just want more time." She reached across and touched his arm. She said, "You have time. Use it." He did. The 2 years before Eli left for Tucson were years in which Clement was deliberately present with his eldest son in the specific ways that are only available when you know the days are finite. He took Eli out on the long fence rides and talked to him about the land and the cattle and the operation of a ranch, not because he expected Eli to take it over, but because it was his to give, and he wanted to give it. He asked about the drawings and the sketchbook, and sat with the sketchbook open on his knee on evenings looking at what Eli saw when he looked at the world. Eli drew his father one more time before he left, a proper portrait face forward. The specific quality of Clement's gaze caught exactly, the patience and the depth of it. He gave it to Nora rather than Clement, and told her it was for her because she would keep it in the right place. She had looked at the portrait and looked at Eli and said, "It's perfect," and meant it. She put it in the parlor alongside the first drawing, the one of Clement from the back, and the drawing of Clara Ruth as a newborn, and the photograph of her parents' house, finally face forward in a frame on the mantelpiece, because this was now the place from which she looked at all other places, and there was no longer any need to put it down. Eli left for the school in Tucson in September 1890 with a trunk of clothes and his sketchbooks and the self-containment of a boy who had been raised by people who believed in him. He wrote every week. His letters were like his drawings, careful and precise and full of what he observed. He came home that first Christmas and Clement stood on the porch and watched the wagon come up the road, and when Eli stepped down, taller and more defined, Clement put both hands on his son's shoulders and held on for a moment without speaking, and Eli let him. The ranch went on. Thomas, now 14 and practically grown, took on more of the work with a cheerful competence that surprised no one who knew him. Patrick, at 7, was everywhere at once, a phenomenon rather than a child, and Clara Ruth, now 4, was the household's ruling authority on questions of justice and fairness, a role she had assumed so naturally that no one had noticed when it happened. In the January of 1891, Nora sat down at the kitchen table on a quiet afternoon while both younger children were occupied, and Thomas was out with Clement, and she opened the account book she kept for the household and looked at the numbers that had been accumulating in the good column for several years now, and she felt the quiet satisfaction of a person who has built something solid. She looked around the kitchen, the stove that heated well since the pipe had been repaired, the herbs on the windowsill, the hook by the door where Clement's hat lived when he was in the house, the worn place on the table where the boys had done their schoolwork for years, the mending basket in the corner. She looked at the ring on her hand, the turquoise set in silver. She was 35 years old. She had come to Arizona at 27 with a single bag and a face-down photograph, and a stubbornness the desert had recognized. And she had found a man who stood in doorways a long time looking at something he was afraid to want, and she had stayed, and they had built this. She heard the front door and Clement's boots and his voice saying something to Thomas outside, and then the boots on the porch and in the hall, and she turned in her chair, and he came around the corner and stopped in the kitchen doorway because he was a man who had never quite stopped doing that, pausing in doorways to take in what was in the room, and she was in the room, and he looked at her the way he had been looking at her for years now, with the open face of a man who knows the value of what he is looking at. He said, "You are doing accounts." She said, "I am." He said, "Are we solvent?" She said, "Comfortably." He said, "Good." He came across and sat down in the chair beside her and leaned over to look at the account book, and his shoulder was warm against hers. She leaned into him without thinking about it, because it had become the most natural thing she knew. Outside the window, the Arizona afternoon was turning the gold and copper of October, of November, of all the beautiful, difficult months that had gone into making this house what it was. Thomas called from the barn about something, and Clement called back an answer, and Clara Ruth's voice came from upstairs in an elaborate, ongoing conversation with her dolls, and Patrick was at the kitchen door with a lizard that he had found and which he needed someone to verify was interesting. Nora said, "It is very interesting, Patrick." Patrick said, "Can I keep it?" Clement said, "Absolutely not." Patrick looked at Nora. Nora looked at Clement. Clement looked at the lizard. He looked at Patrick's face. He looked at Nora's face, which was not telling him what to do but was watching with the warm gray eyes that had always seen through him completely. He said, "You can keep it until tomorrow morning, and it sleeps in the barn." Patrick accepted this negotiated settlement with the air of a skilled diplomat and disappeared with his lizard toward the barn. Clement looked at Nora. She said, "Very sensibly handled." He said, "I am occasionally sensible." She said, "More than occasionally." He took her hand on the table, the account book between them, the afternoon light through the window, the familiar sounds of the house and the ranch and the family they had made together filling all the space around them. He said, "I have been thinking." She said, "About what?" He said, "About the fact that every morning when I come in from the early work and you are in this kitchen, I think the same thing I thought that first morning, that I am a man who has been given something he did not know to ask for." She looked at him. She said, "You have told me that before." He said, "I will probably tell you again." She said, "Good." He said, "I mean to go on telling you for a considerable amount of time." She said, "I intend to listen for a considerable amount of time." He lifted her hand and pressed his mouth to the back of it with the deliberate tenderness that was one of the particular qualities of Clement Donovan when he was not performing anything, when he was simply himself in his own house with the woman he loved in the October afternoon of 1891. And the world outside was the hard and beautiful country they had chosen, and the world inside was everything that had grown from a needle and white cotton, and a man standing for a long time in a doorway learning how to want something again. Clara Ruth appeared in the kitchen doorway, 4 years old and completely composed, holding a doll and surveying her parents with the particular expression she wore when she was about to make an announcement. She said, "I need someone to help me fix Annabel's dress." Nora said, "Bring her here." Clara Ruth crossed the kitchen with great dignity and climbed into Nora's lap and presented the doll, whose dress had a torn hem. Nora reached for her mending basket and found the needle and the thread, and Clement sat beside her with his daughter in his wife's lap, and the account book and the turquoise ring and the afternoon light, and the needle moved through the fabric with the same quiet certainty it had always moved, mending what had broken, making whole what had come apart. Outside, Thomas was whistling in the barn. Patrick was telling his lizard about its new accommodations. Eli was in Tucson drawing light. And in Harlow's Creek, in a house with good window glass and a front porch and a walnut tree in the kitchen garden, the Donovan family continued in the particular and unrepeatable shape of itself, the one that had been made from grief and stubbornness and patience, and a morning in October 1883, when a woman had found 2 shirts at the bottom of a laundry basket and had simply, quietly begun.